and I'm the owner and director of Waves of Harmony. And today I have with me Mick Georges, who is the co-owner and director of Keystone Australia. He's a chaplain and counselor, and I'm really excited to have him here with me for part two of a discussion that started with an interest in religion and spirituality and has moved into the space of moral injury and some conditions like PTSD. So welcome, Mick.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be back again. This is always very exciting, and I greatly appreciated our last talk, and I've got a fair bit of reflection still to do on that. And so here we are again, which will be a great challenge. So looking forward to this.
A challenge in a good way, I'm hoping.
Absolutely.
So I won't go too much into your background because we did that in the other video. So if people want to sort of check out your credentials and how you got to where you are now, that would be in the first video. But I see in the background of this screen that you do have a poster that's Moral Injury AU. So do you want to just give me a little synopsis of that and your work in that area specifically, just to start?
Yeah. Thank you. So we've got two companies, my wife and I, Keystone Australia, which does a fair bit in the coaching, mentoring, leadership, and mental health space. And we developed another company called Moral Injury AU, which to the best of our knowledge is still the only company in Australia that is actually providing a qualification for people to support those with moral injury. And I use those terms very, very carefully, and we'll unpack that a little bit as we go through. I found my background is defence, and I was an infantry officer for 20 years, then transferred across to chaplaincy. And when I started off my chaplaincy career, we had a lot of soldiers coming back from Afghanistan in about the 2010, 11, 12 mark. And a lot of them had some very significant mental health issues. And here's me, new chaplain, and my mindset has changed from being that frontline officer to, hey, I need to get alongside and support people. And I was being inundated with people that were being diagnosed with PTSD, but the treatment was making them worse. And I was literally having wives coming in to say, Chaplain George, what's going on here? There's a psychiatrist, a psychologist, a case manager, a GP, you know, everybody's involved, and my husband's getting worse. Yeah. What is going on? I remember one lady came in and she said, my husband lost it. We're just in the car, just driving, and he lost it. He demanded that I stop. He walked 20 kilometers home.
Wow.
And she said, I'm at my wit's end. He just spends all of his time in his shed. And so I stumbled across this moral injury, this idea of moral injury, and it's really in its infancy, and was able to start applying it very pragmatically, and have found that it has been a major tool for my ability to support others, particularly in the area of mental health.
This is fascinating. So today's conversation is going to focus on just that. So we're really going to try to contain the talk, even though Mick,
might be a problem at all.
I could talk for hours about this, but we're going to focus some time today unpacking moral injury related to mental health and mental health conditions such, like you mentioned, PTSD. And you're going to talk a little bit about how this is kind of emerging even into the into diagnostic tools and into the DSM-5, and how there's been some talk about these things starting to come out, and ways that we can use that as therapists, I suppose, to our advantage, so that we can actually work with the person and provide some therapy that's going to be valuable for them and get them through that space, and not have people walking 20 kilometers because of old injuries.
Yes, and not hanging on to stuff for your decades. So Pip, is it okay if I share a diagram?
Yep.
So I'm going to share my screen at this point.
Yep.
So we have somebody who has come to see us if we're we're some form of counselor or support person. And just because if I can just backtrack to your intro, you said I'm a chaplain and a counselor. Just to highlight, I'm not a trained mental health clinician, and I'm a pastoral carer and a pastor itself. But any one of us have had people come into our office or tap us on the shoulder and say, hey, I've got some of these symptoms, and I'm really, really struggling. And of course, that's a good start point. And we may start that discussion about causality. We may sort of start, okay, here we can do some symptom mitigation. But these symptoms, of course, are very common symptoms across a whole variety of different conditions. So for example, these symptoms can all occur with somebody with a trauma-related condition such as PTSD. Now, here is a real key for me as a pastoral counselor. If I am supporting somebody and they're telling me a story, so they've got these symptoms, they're telling me a story. If that story starts to go from past tense, where they're remembering the story, to the present tense, and it's like they're reliving it, that's a massive indication to me that actually this is a trauma-related condition that they've got. Because what's happening is as they're remembering the incident, they're being re-triggered, and the incident isn't passing the amygdala hippocampus. They're getting into that flight, fight, freeze, fall response by remembering the incident, which means that the incident isn't getting to the prefrontal cortex. We've got a trauma-related response at this particular point in time. So for me as a pastoral carer, I'd be referring them on to a mental health clinician, and I'd then want to parallel the mental health clinician in the support for the individual. Same symptoms, but the person could have burnout. And you can see some of the key words there: cynical about work, procrastination. But one of the key things that I've identified, which is really helpful, is that the symptoms have proximity to work itself. So what I mean by that is that you'll see a decrease in symptoms on Friday afternoon and an increase on a Sunday afternoon if they're a Monday to Friday type person. So that proximity to work is a real key there. Same symptoms, and the issue could be moral injury. And there, when the individual's telling the story of some things, some stresses, some experiences that they've had that they can't reconcile, I'm listening in particular for the words of guilt or shame, self-loathing, that betrayal, loss of trust. They are really, really critical. And you can see the other words there: purpose, meaning, that there's a loss of purpose, meaning, and identifying what they're doing there, or within that situation. There's a really important link here, and this isn't completely black and white, but it's pretty generic, and it is helpful to understand that when it comes to moral injury and PTSD, it's about a single incident. Now, it can be multiple single incidences. So for soldiers, for example, on the battlefield, I could have a contact here, I could have a mate lose a limb here, and et cetera, et cetera. But I'm looking for the single incident, and people telling me about single instances that they haven't been able to reconcile and process. There's a link between trauma, PTSD, and burnout, where we see some risk-taking behavior. So for trauma-related, people wanting to feel something, and they may be speeding in a car and becoming more and more dangerous there, or drinking too much alcohol. With burnout, we also see that risk-taking behavior, in that it may come about with being more and more vocal about the displeasure they have with their hierarchy in more and more public places, or getting on the internet and sending dodgy emails internally using the work computer system. That's an indicator of burnout, that risk-taking behavior, but there's commonality there. And finally, there's a link between moral injury and burnout, where we have low energy. Now, let me just clarify. With burnout, often you'll have people being a little bit hypervigilant, or having huge adrenaline whilst they're at work, but they don't have any energy when they're away from work. So I work with New South Wales Police as a chaplain with New South Wales Police, and I'll often hear a story that, yeah, my husband or my wife, they just come home and they sit on the couch. They don't want to interact with the family anymore because they've just exhausted. And moral injury, you have that same low energy because there's a real loss of that purpose, meaning, or that real betrayal by the organisation. I hear that a lot, that you get a little bit of that quiet quitting in the workplace, because people can often label it as burnout, but actually they've lost the belief in what they were doing with the company that they're working for, because I don't know, that the company has betrayed, that there's perception of betrayal in some way, shape, or form. The company's gone against its espoused value system. Let me pause there. Does that make sense, Andrew? Does it?
Yeah, and actually, I have to confess, I was trying to tie these all together with something you brought up in the previous talk, which goes back to that sort of your definition of sort of the religious and spiritual place in all of us, which is our worldview. And I think in all of these things, the worldview has been challenged in some ways, or it's dissonance in those spaces that creates the unease, that creates the symptoms that come out. Am I right?
Certainly within the moral injury space. So if PTSD, and there's a strong linkage because you certainly can have PTSD and moral injury combined. So I've got a policeman who's gone to a car crash scene and there's multiple casualties. I can have the trauma-related response and they get re-triggered every time they go past that intersection or they smell something. But then I can certainly also have the moral injury because the ambulance took too long and I was doing mouth to mouth and doing the compressions, but I just got too tired and I was there by myself and the ambulance took an hour and a half and as a result the person passed away and I perceive I could have done more. So when we're in that type of situation, it's really important when I'm supporting somebody with that. First up, I've got to stabilize the trauma response because I said before, the issue doesn't actually hit the prefrontal cortex. So there's no point in me trying to do anything in the moral injury space until we've at least stabilized the trauma response. And if we look at trauma, this is a little bit basic, but I find it a bit helpful. If PTSD is a threat to your mortality, you as a human being, moral injury has been a breach of your morality.
Yeah.
Yep. And moral injury can occur by either doing or not doing something that has breached those moral standards, or somebody else either doing or not doing something to you. So they've let you down in some way. And so you can't reconcile that. So you and I could certainly live through the same experience and I could walk away just going, okay, that was just a life lesson and I put that away in the memory bank. Whereas other people like yourself, you could walk away and go, man, that was so traumatic. I nearly died in that situation and I feel really let down by an organization that didn't provide us enough resources to protect us.
Yeah, yeah. So it's great how you've given us some actual examples of how this plays out a little bit. So I guess the question is, can we look at how, as therapists, how do these people come into our door, first of all? How do they seek us out? How do they seek us out? I mean, obviously you have moral injury AU, so it's pretty obvious. But for somebody like me, how would I identify that in somebody? How would I identify that it's not just post-traumatic stress or burnout, that there is some element, like you said, that can kind of cross over? And how you did mention some diagnostic tools that are out there to be able to sort of find this in people. So can you just speak to that a little bit?
You've unpacked
there
a fair bit there. So let me take a back step. So say in Australia's context, moral injury, we're only really looking at moral injury being identified since about 2008-9. It goes back to first being mentioned in the 90s, but perhaps it's easy to understand this way. The way that I can explain. Imagine you're an 18, 19-year-old soldier and you get sent to Vietnam. And you do what you need to do in Vietnam, and you come home again, and all of society, well, not all, but a large majority of society says, what you did was morally wrong. Wow. So the government's giving you a gun, you've shot a bunch of people, you've come back, and normally that's called murder. But even in a wartime situation, think of World War II, we'll say, well, that's just war theory. It's what you did was actually, you're a hero, let's give you a medal for that. But if now the majority of society or a large portion of society says what you did was morally wrong, wow, that becomes really, really difficult. And so an example I give is how many we saw a very negative mental health response from Vietnam, from both the Australian and certainly the US service personnel. And my father was one of them. He came off the plane and was told to change out of his uniform before he got off the plane. That's his first experience returning to Australia after his tour overseas. That's not a great indictment that what he did was morally correct. So think about how many mental health institutions have you heard being set up in Vietnam compared to treat all the soldiers for what they call the American war, versus the amount of mental health institutions were set up in Australia and the US as a result of our soldiers who went and fought over there. The same can go in Afghanistan. How many of our soldiers have come back and because there's been some question marks about whether we were right or when we exited, had we made any difference, for example? How many mental health institutions have been set up in Afghanistan for the Taliban fighters or whichever group they were with,
Yeah.
because they've been able to reconcile that. Okay, so some interesting examples there. Because moral injury is so recent, it isn't currently in the DSM-5. There's been some notifications that a term called moral distress may well be inserted into the DSM-5 in September this year, which is really interesting.
Yep.
But if you are a mental health clinician and your Bible for diagnosis is the DSM and moral injury isn't in there, well, that becomes really tricky. Whereas there are overlapping symptoms that occur for both PTSD and moral injury. And so we saw some of those in the box. And so you're a mental health clinician, comes in, they talk to you about a single incident, a traumatic car crash or something, and they're talking about the symptoms, and all those symptoms align to PTSD. What are you going to diagnose it with? It's PTSD, because moral injury, one, you haven't been trained in it, and two, it's not in the DSM. So it's not even an option. And remarkably, for anyone who's watching this, go check out the chapter on moral injury in the recent Royal Commission into service personnel and veteran suicide. Because the preface, which is only a couple of paragraphs to that whole chapter, actually says all these issues that we've identified in all these other departments, and DVA, Department of Defense, Justice, all this sort of stuff, all these issues that we've identified cause moral injury. And moral injury leads to veteran suicide. And so there's a whole list of recommendations that come out of there. In fact, one of the recommendations is that moral injury training should be provided to all current serving members and all veterans in Australia. So that's something that Moral Injury AU is doing. We just did a trial with a sub-branch, the Cumberland sub-branch of the RSL in New South Wales. They actually funded us to go and run a very successful trial with veterans up there. And so we're now talking about expanding that out across different veteran centres to try and meet that recommendation, because unfortunately, whilst it was endorsed by the government, it wasn't funded by the government. And so, we've got to get out there. So that was an awful lot to talk about. But the WHO recognises, the World Health Organization recognises moral injury. They've endorsed diagnostic tools for moral injury. And on our courses, we actually teach people how to use those not that they're very complex, but it means that you can identify, because it's not on the DSM, we can't diagnose, but we identify, and we can't treat, but we support those with moral injury. Which then gets back to any clinicians watching this going, wow, I see this all the time. I see people all the time coming in and their primary issue is a betrayal, loss of trust, a loss of purpose and meaning, as a foundational problem. What do I do with that? Well, we've got to get into utilising some of the tools that have been proven within the moral injury space to rectify that, because, and this is my last point, the treatment for PTSD actually is detrimental to moral injury. And so that becomes really concerning. Hence, we get the guy walking out and doing the 20K walk in the car.
Yeah. So I think I want to just link back to what you said before about this sort of foundational problem that we discussed in part one of this talk about the moral injury space is more of the spiritual space, the morals and the values, and it's not necessarily the symptoms. It's the symptom in itself, but it's in that inner space, and it's in that, because it's conflicting in the mind, isn't it, with their moral compass. Yeah,
a moral compass, and hence we've got the compass on our logo. Who would have thought?
Subliminal messaging.
Subconscious level there moving through. So within the, I wouldn't say necessarily that with somebody with moral injury would personally identify as having a spiritual problem. They may not identify spirituality, may be very materialistic in their view. Where I attempt to support those sort of people is going right back to stage one and identifying, tell me the story or the series of stories that you haven't been able to reconcile. And so once we've identified, okay, where are the friction points? What haven't you been able to reconcile? Do you perceive yourself to be the perpetrator there, or do you perceive yourself to be the victim? Or do you see yourself to be both in the one story?
Yeah, right.
And a spoiler alert, where this all gets to is forgiveness, either forgiveness of self or forgiveness of others.
Yeah. Can I
So,
just
mm,
stop right there? Because I want to go back to a point that you made earlier that I want to reiterate, but also have you talk through it a little bit more. You talked about when somebody comes in, initially they could still be going into that it is happening state, and you send them back off because they're actually in that fight and flight state. They're not able to actually come out of that in order for you to work with them. How would you send somebody off? How would, like, I'm just thinking of practically as the person who's working with them right there. How do you say that to somebody, and how do you refer them to, or who do you refer them to in that case? Just thinking practically.
yeah, well done. So the fortunate thing I have is owning a company which has some really high grade mental health clinicians, so clin psychs, all these registered psychs and counselors who are also co-trained with moral injury.
Yep.
What I do is I give reassurance to the individual and I actually explain,
Yeah.
hey, this is what I'm observing. Here is our path to success.
Hmm.
Um, we go through we have a brain diagram that we utilize that we unfortunately don't have time to go today. But
Yeah.
I actually walk somebody through the journey of how the brain works and how at our subconscious, we often have our room. This is my labeling here. I love this name. You're going to have to just keep up with me here. In our subconscious, we have this room of unprocessed issues that I don't like to address.
Yep.
Yep. And so what a lot of us do is when you get those issues of that I can't address that,
Hmm.
I chuck it in the room and I close the door. Unfortunately, that still draws on our emotional stress and is a rock that we're carrying around, which is a weight for us. And the more we utilize this methodology of chucking stuff in the room, the fuller the room gets. And everybody's room is a different size, and we don't know how full the room is. And if
Yeah.
you utilize that methodology, eventually the room comes full, and you go and open up that door just to chuck something small in, and everything falls out. Which is
Yeah.
why, as those working in the counseling field, the support field, have to be very, very careful that we're actually processing stuff.
Yeah. You
Because
did
if
mention that as well, that there can be a harmful way of addressing this. Do you want to actually, is this the time to actually talk about that a little bit? What are the
uh,
harmful, what happens in that?
in terms of
In terms of treatment, in terms of like your interactions with somebody that can actually make it worse? What are the things that are
oh
happening?
yeah, so when you're talking about often so for example, if I'm using CBT
Yeah.
without also addressing the issue, so if somebody's got trauma and I'm using cognitive behavior therapy, which means that I am talking about the issue and re-triggering it.
Yeah.
Well, what you're redoing, if you're not providing the answer in terms of addressing the breach of morality at the same time, somebody's just
Mm,
being re-triggered, and you haven't
mm,
actually scratched the itch. And the itch being that there was a betrayal that they
mm.
actually have to offer forgiveness for.
Yeah.
And
And this is how, yeah, it's tied into the forgiveness.
yeah. And
Yeah.
so now forgiveness of self is a really interesting term. As a Christian pastor, I don't say I forgive myself. I get my forgiveness through Jesus and what he did for me on the cross and the grace that comes out of that. Now, that's good when you've got that worldview. If somebody has a different worldview, for example, they're an atheist or agnostic or something, then I would go through a process. There is a formal forgiveness. I mean, we spoke about forgiveness therapy in the previous discussion that we have. It is a real thing. Forgiveness therapy is right there, and it is a
Mm,
particularly helpful methodology. And I don't use a particularly different methodology when I'm going through the forgiveness process. There are foundational universal principles of forgiving somebody.
mm,
Um, One of the pushbacks is, well, what happens? There's a couple of pushbacks when you start talking to somebody about forgiveness. One of the pushbacks is, well, what happens if the person has passed away? How do I forgive somebody who's
mm,
passed away? Or what happens if the person isn't sorry?
mm.
I had an interesting discussion with somebody the other day who said it is impossible to forgive somebody if they haven't said sorry. Um, and so a lot of these are pretty complex issues that we don't have time to unpack. The good
Yeah.
news is
Yeah.
that there are absolutely methodologies that can be utilized for somebody who's struggling with of forgiving somebody who they can't face off or who aren't even sorry for what they've done or
Yeah.
how do you forgive an organization, a faceless organization whose policies
Yeah.
are, but there are things that can be done. And in the same way of offering an apology, if you're the perpetrator, the
Mm.
same barriers can come up. What happens if the person isn't alive or whatever? Um,
Yeah.
there is certainly a foundational methodology that can be utilized where people can go, okay, I've now reconciled that. I can move on, which is
Yeah.
just terrific to see when that happens.
I'm going to just share something with you. We talked about this a little bit prior. You brought up this idea of forgiveness therapy, and I had not actually thought of it as a thing, but I have talked about forgiveness in sessions with people I work with. And in my experience, I've found it's really difficult to facilitate a person through forgiveness, especially in the cases where it's been like a deep-rooted trauma like sexual abuse or violence or bullying. When I'm not sure they're actually ready for that. So how do you actually have to first determine the readiness for that person to be there, or they've actually given you that go ahead? Because I
Yeah,
think
yeah, yeah.
otherwise it can't happen, can it?
And it is a process, and we're very systematic, and I'm really sorry we don't have time to go through it, and perhaps we can at another podcast. But
Yeah.
it is a very deliberate process,
Yeah.
and somebody might get up to say step 4 of the process and go, you know what, I can't progress.
And then they're stuck like in that space.
Correct. But here's the thing, and this is critical. Within our doctrine, we say there's only 4 options people have when it comes to being a victim. That somebody or an organization, something has happened that has breached their moral standards and they can't reconcile. One, they can seek revenge. And I can tell you that doesn't work. It does not work. 2, they can hide it underneath a rug and it can just sit there. And that's the rock that you're carrying. And
Yeah.
it just grows and grows and grows.
Yeah.
A 3, they can, I like to describe it as that it becomes a filter, like a filter through which they see the world,
Mm.
like a contact lens. And what happens is that they become a bit of a professional victim. And that my experience is that if somebody's got unresolved moral injury and it grows and grows, then you start seeing moral injury everywhere because you haven't been able to develop that methodology of forgiveness and reconciliation.
Yeah.
And so you continue just getting this in, and we've all counseled those people who are sort of, hey, the world is just against me and I see no joy in the world.
They're like those fly catchers, those sticky ones that it just seems everything just sort of sticks
Yeah,
to that, doesn't it?
correct. So we've got those 3 negative responses. Revenge, I can just try and hide from it.
Yep.
I become
Everything.
the professional victim, or I forgive.
Yeah.
That's it. They're the only 4 options that I certainly know about.
Yeah.
And option 2 and 3 are pretty strongly linked there.
Yeah.
And so when I'm supporting somebody, what I'll do is I'll highlight this very early on in the piece.
Mm.
And I can say, look, I can help you with option 4. And we've got a great journey to go on with that.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
sometimes that journey is a 60-minute journey, and feeding them 60 minutes and people are out. And that's often my experience. Sometimes it takes a number of sessions with people, and maybe
Yeah.
with others, it can take a great deal of time.
Yeah.
But the reality is that as a support person, I make it really clear I can only help you with option 4.
Yeah.
If you're not ready for that, that's okay. Hey, we've got to 3 steps through this process. That's great. When you're ready
Yeah.
for step 4, come back and see me.
Yeah.
And so therefore the person's got some ownership over that
Yeah.
whole process. And it's incredibly important. And I think that some of the historic schools of thought, so a Freudian type approach would be, hey,
Mm.
which I don't want to, and look, I'm not an expert by any stretch of the imagination, but Freudian, that whole approach is still somewhat ingrained, I think, sometimes within our mental health industry, because it allows for lots of sessions. Let's continue to unpack, and you're a victim, and
Yeah.
yeah, your
I'm
parents did
I'm with you. I love the sessions where it's like 60 minutes and we've gotten to the bottom of it and they actually have this like aha, and it's like
yes,
amazing, and it's like they won't forget that moment. I won't forget that moment, but I never have to see them again. Well, for that particular reason at least, which is great.
Yeah.
And I
And
love that. But you're right. It's different with everybody, and every situation is different. And how many things have stuck if they're in that place, or whatever the trauma was, or whatever the offense was, could be very different in how we treat that and how it does and how they are with the treatment. Like you said, could get stuck along the way, or could just beautifully be ready and move through it. So there's so many things. Mick, I'm aware of the time, and I know that within each of these like little sort of vignettes that we're sort of giving to our listeners, that there's a whole recording almost in there. I actually want to talk a little bit in broad terms, because you've given us some background in these spaces. It just seems like this is such a vulnerable and complex space to be working in. So I want to ask you, like you've mentioned that you're not a psychologist, obviously, or a psychiatrist. What kind of I mean, but you're obviously, you know what you're doing, and you've started this whole company based on it. What kind of training is really important? What can somebody like myself or my colleagues, a music therapist or a counselor or a trauma therapist or even a counselor, what can we do to sort of train up in this area? I mean, should we sign up
yeah,
with you?
yeah. I was going to say we're the only ones in Australia who are doing it at the moment, and
Hmm.
it's we do a 3-day intensive to get somebody from zero. And the great news is I've had pastors do it, certainly chaplains, clinical psychologists, registered psychologists, behavioral psychologists, social workers, and I
Yeah.
get a uniform response, which is once your eyes are open to this, as a counselor, all of a sudden it's not that just because you got to hammer everything's a nail.
Yeah. I was gonna
It,
say.
it is actually a situation where you go, I now recognize so many, the most common thing I hear from a mental health clinician who has undergone some of our training is, I have seen this throughout my entire career and I wasn't able to name it. And now I understand what it is, and I now have a methodology to address it.
Great. Yeah.
And for me, that just warms my heart. I go, that is terrific.
Yeah.
That is great.
Yeah.
So the only two systems that I'm aware of within Australia, there's Defence uses partial narrative disclosure, which was designed for a defence environment. Moral Injury AU, I looked at the defence one and studied the defence one and went, okay, that's interesting. Myself and some of the other people who are working within the Moral Injury AU space, we developed another methodology which uses some of the proven theories behind moral injury and where the support is. And I guess my practical testimony is, hey, it works. The methodology that we've implemented has worked. We've been using it for a number of years now. The interesting thing I've found is, and there's increasing studies on this, that the prevalence of moral injury outside of it's easy to see on the battlefield, because that's where you give a kid a gun and tell them to go shoot somebody.
Yeah.
But when they've done studies, we're seeing higher instances of moral injury in, say, the medical field, frontline workers. I see it in the corporate setting all the time. And I did this training with parking inspectors. Now, you think you're a parking inspector. Every time you're walking around somebody, your job is to allow the free flowing of parking. Otherwise, disabled people can't use disabled car, ambulances can't. It becomes a huge issue. And so you're doing a good job, which nobody really is happy about. And you're just walking around doing your job, and people will just come and abuse you all day, every day. And so on any given day, a parking inspector will get, let's say, half a dozen negative responses. You haven't even given them a ticket. There's just people walking by going, you're proud of yourself? And that's a moral injury.
It's a tough job.
Yeah. And so when I delivered this training to parking inspectors, wow, it was revolutionary to go, okay, this is what's been bugging me. So I certainly see this. I had a contract in a prison here in Canberra as the chaplain. The prevalence of moral injury with detainees, you go, yep, got it. But prison officers, off the chart as well, because they don't have the resources. They're not seeing they're actually achieving what they're trying to achieve, which is rehabilitation, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's moral injury breaches there. Yeah.
Mick, just hearing you talk about this is like sort of like I can feel in myself, I'm sensing this like, wow, I can feel it in my body. There's a visceral reaction that I'm having. So my next question is about, how do you, as the clinician, and you're running this training, but you're also working in this space, how do you look after yourself? How do you address any, countertransference or any sort of things that you sense coming up and absorb from other people coming into that space? Do you have supervision, or how do you look after yourself as a clinician?
Yeah, well, All of us are required to have some form of supervision and a great coach mentor as well who helps me out. I've got a very supportive family. I must admit, I talk when somebody asks me the question, I talk about situational empathy. And situational empathy for me involves I am with you 100% of the time when you're here, and I'm empathetic for when you're here. But if I'm lying awake at 2 o'clock in the morning, worried about you and worried about how you're going on with life, then that's a real red alert for me, because I can't live somebody else's life.
Yeah.
I think if you've been in the sort of as a pastoral carer, if you're in the mental health world for any period of time, you'll undoubtedly have gone through something, experienced suicide, or had somebody that you're supporting who's unfortunately taken their own life, or had a really negative impact. And you've got to realize, hey, if you maintain situational empathy, I'm with you in the moment, but at the same time, once that issue's finished, or my session's finished, then the session's finished. I can't live somebody else's life. Otherwise, we start taking on, I call it white knight syndrome. A lot of people in the counselling field, we're white knights. We love to save, and it's a bit cliche, but the damsel in distress from the dragon. And the better we get, we need the bigger and bigger dragon and more damsels to feel like we're being fulfilled. It's a really slippery slope. Yeah. And so white knights, great. Love white knights. I'm a white knight. It's really, really important, but you've also got to recognize, hey, I'm not here to save the world. As a Christian, Jesus has already done that, which is great. So within my worldview, I've got a way to be able to say, hey, it's not up to me to save everybody, but I can be used to support people, which is just an absolute privilege.
Yeah.
And lots of exercise and Brazilian jiu-jitsu so I can choke people out. Yeah. That's it.
We did have that small conversation off the camera about Tai Chi and Qigong and all those things as well. We have to have our outlets as well, don't we?
Yeah, we do.
Ourselves. Yeah.
And you know, for many years, my wife knew if I hadn't been to training, she'd kick me out the door and go to Brazilian jiu-jitsu, go choke somebody out or be choked out, and then you come back. And I'd go, yeah, I'm all good to go. Let's go. It's all great. Can't walk the next day, but you know. Sorry, I cut you off there. Go.
It's awesome. So I think, look, I mean, I could ask so many more questions, but we would be here for days and days and days. So what that tells me is that I've already flagged and bookmarked a couple of topics that we can come back and have more discussions and conversations on my yellow chair or from the video. But I want to just point out how important this space is and what you're discussing today, and how you've actually, again, I go back to how I introduced you in the first video, which is you walk the walk. You've actually found an area that needs attention, and you've put your energy and your knowledge and your passion behind it, and actually come up with a place where people can go and actually look after themselves really well. So I'm really, I feel privileged to know you. I feel really just humbled that you would speak on this conversation with me and just do me the favor of being interviewed and sharing that wealth of experience that you have and how you've gone forth and done that. There's so much more there. And you know, we say it all the time, we need to really chat more, but you know, there's always things happening, a lot of moving parts, but I really sincerely mean it. I'm really grateful for these conversations. Is there anything that you'd like to finish and add at the end here?
I'm just going to recognize that braid diagram, which the first that was largely developed by Dr. Shannon Hood, and he's one of the real good subject matter experts in this space. And my tidbits were very, very small into that, but I greatly appreciate it for him, because I think that is very, very helpful for particularly people, clinicians, but also if you're just a team leader, to have an understanding of you don't just need to be sitting there going, oh, I've got somebody stressed in front of me and I don't know what to do. That allows you to start explaining a potential way ahead for them and encouraging them to get help, and you can parallel that process to make sure they're getting help. So it's a really good diagram for anybody in the clinical field or just in the leadership field to be able to understand how we can start to assist others. But thank you for your time again. It's been very enjoyable. Always love talking, and particularly about passions, and moral injuries is certainly one of mine. So thank you for the opportunity to do that.
I will guarantee that after I put this together, I'll be putting some links into the information of anything I share so that people can access it, along with, of course, the video and the content that's been in this talk. And I just want to say that to everybody, that we look for these conversations haven't been like teased out a whole bunch. We often learn a lot while we're going through the conversation ourselves and learning from it and moving and progressing forward. So I look forward to people in the audience's input, and you can support us by listening and sharing the information. Thanks for coming along, Mick, and it's been awesome. It's been great. Thank you.
Hey, anytime. Thank you very much.